Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming here. So I'm Vivek Nityananda. I'm at the Biosciences Institute at Newcastle University. And it's a great pleasure to welcome today's speaker, who's Professor Jaap de Roode. And Jaap de Roode, he started his academic career actually, his MSc in the Netherlands, but did his PhD in the UK at the University of Edinburgh. And he's already taught me some things that I did not know about the UK. But he is now a professor, a Samuel Candler Dobbs Professor of Biology at Emory University, where he's the director of the Infectious Diseases Across Scales training program. And the program trains graduate students in interdisciplinary science to study and control infectious diseases. He's interested in the ecology and evolution of infectious diseases and studies them in a whole variety of systems, as he will no doubt be talking to us today. These include infectious diseases of monarch butterflies, of honeybees, and of humans. And I think he's kind of put all his years of research together and other research together to a book, which will be available after the talk. Yeah, and the book it's called Doctors by Nature: How Ants, Apes, and Other Animals Heal Themselves. So look out for the book when you step out, and he'll be there to sign copies. So please find it. And I'm not going to take any more time, so yeah, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and sound good? Excellent. Well, thanks for being here. Thanks for that introduction, and I'm so glad that I could introduce you to Fisherman's Friend. Yeah. So, for those here who don't know, that I learned about him here in the UK, and I had a cold 3 weeks ago, and I've got this lingering itchy throat, so I'm self-medicating, which is very appropriate for today's talk with Fisherman's Friend and all sorts of other stuff. So, but that's that. So. Thanks so much for being here. I know there is a big game in town today. When I arrived by train earlier today, there were a lot of people in red shirts from Benfica, it looked like, and they were already very loud. And I guess they're even louder now. But thank you for being here and talking about science instead. I want to dedicate this talk to Jane Goodall, who, of course, left us a few weeks ago. Yeah, you can clap for her, definitely. I mean, the reason I want to dedicate this talk to her is that she was so instrumental in really breaking down the barriers between humans and other animals and really ascribing personalities and traits to those animals that we used to think are very human and uniquely human. And everything that I'm going to talk about fits within that picture. So monarch butterflies are the system I work on, and that really got me into thinking about animals using medicine. Now, monarch butterflies are very famous for their migration that they undertake every year from Canada, the United States, down to Mexico, where literally hundreds of millions of monarchs come together. I had the pleasure actually of being at the Natural History Museum in London yesterday, and they have some monarchs in their collection, but sometimes they get blown over across the Atlantic on big storms. So even here, people sometimes collect them. But when you go to Mexico, and I've had the pleasure of doing that multiple times, you really go there, you see these trees covered in butterflies, and you really don't see the trees for the butterflies. And this is really a spectacular sight, and this is also why people love monarch butterflies and dress up like them. And I used to joke that these are the undergraduate students at Emory, where I work, but I don't do that anymore. But these are people, just citizens that are super excited about monarchs and have festivals. This festival is normally held this coming weekend. Unfortunately, this time it's not going to happen because of the government shutdown that we are having. But people love dressing up like monarchs, and it's great because you can really talk about science and how important nature is. And I always say, there are very few people that would dress up like a cockroach or be excited about a tree covered in roaches like this tree is covered in butterflies. And so monarchs are very famous, they're very popular. But that's not why I started studying monarch butterflies. I always like to tell people that I study monarchs because they become sick. And monarchs become sick with a very interesting parasite. Now you have to bear with me. I studied parasitology at the University of Edinburgh, so I really like parasites. Okay, so that's just a little, not in me or on me, but I like them as a concept, and I like studying them and really thinking about parasites are, organisms too. They have struggles as well. So monarch butterflies, like our pets, like us, they get sick. And so that is why I study monarch butterflies. And they become sick with this parasite. It's actually quite related to the parasites that cause malaria in humans. And when there's a lot of these parasites on the abdomen of the butterfly basically gets stuck to the chrysalis. It cannot fly. So this is a really detrimental parasite. And when that happens, sometimes you get wasps that take advantage, because nothing goes to waste in nature. Beautiful paper wasps, cutting up this monarch to feed to her sisters in her nest. One of the really nice things about this parasite is that you can study it really easily. So we can determine whether a butterfly is sick with this parasite without harming the butterfly. So all we do is we put a little sticker on the abdomen of the butterfly and pull that off. And then we pull off some of the scales of the butterfly, but also all the little specks here are the parasites. And I always like to think that this is even less invasive than that horrible thing we stick up our nose to see if we have COVID. But it allows us to really study this parasite in nature and to study how it affects migration and other things. So the way it works is that this parasite, when it's on the abdomen of the female butterfly, when she lays eggs, some of them get stuck onto the eggs and onto the milkweeds that the monarchs use to lay their eggs on. And then the caterpillars eat them up. That is how they become infected. And then inside the caterpillars and the pupae, these parasites replicate to really, really high numbers, so that when the butterfly ecloses again from that chrysalis, she is covered again, or he, in millions of these parasite spores. Now, monarch butterflies are specialist feeders, and so when I moved to the United States to study monarch butterflies, or rather their parasites, in 2005, and I went there for 3 years, and I'm still there. So sometimes you get stuck in a place, especially when you love studying a particular organism like this one. But I learned very quickly that monarch butterflies are very specialist feeders, meaning their caterpillars can only eat milkweeds. And so if you give them lettuce or oak leaves, they will die. They can only eat milkweed. And then I started doing experiments because I realized also from what people already knew, there's a lot of different species of milkweed, and some of them are very toxic, others are not. And so I fed the monarchs on those different species of milkweed that I grew in a greenhouse, and I found that when the milkweeds are very toxic, it really reduces the probability of infection, and it reduces the disease symptoms, so the monarchs really don't get as sick with the more toxic plants. And so that those plants are really medicinal. And that really then spurred the question for me, can the monarch butterflies use this? So if there is medicine out there, can they actively use that medicine? And so we did multiple experiments, first with caterpillars, and we gave caterpillars the choice between the medicinal and the non-medicinal milkweed. The caterpillars were healthy or they were sick, and they had absolutely no preference. But then we thought about it, that kind of makes sense, because caterpillars are not the ones making the choices in the wild, right? It's their mothers that put an egg on a plant. So the caterpillar is born on the food it's gonna eat. So then we did experiments asking if adult butterflies can make the choices. So in this case, we had female butterflies that were either healthy or they were sick. And then we gave them choices between medicinal and a non-medicinal plant in big flight cages in our greenhouse at Emory University. And then what we found is that the infected butterflies had a very strong preference to lay their eggs on the medicinal plants. Excuse me. And what's really interesting about that is that these butterflies already have all these parasites on their abdomen. They can no longer get rid of them. They can also not prevent spreading them to their offspring. But what they can do is when they lay those eggs and spread those parasites, they can provide medicine at the same time. That's going to really help their offspring. So it's a great example of mommy knows best. So animals using medicine is something that has been controversial in science for a long time. And I love this quote. This is William Osler. And if you're in the medical field, you will know him as one of the founders of Johns Hopkins University, and also the person who came up with the idea of the residency program, so that medical students don't just learn in a lecture hall like this, but they go to the bedside of the patients to learn there. So he's very smart, but he was very much a creature of his time, with the idea that humans are special and humans are unique. And so he made the claim that, what sets us apart from other animals is that we use medicine and other animals do not. And that was very similar to the idea, right, that we use tools and animals do not. Jane Goodall debunked that very early on in the 1960s already. So when we talk about animals using medicine, now we know that a lot of animals do it, but we have to be very careful, because what we're talking about is a behavior, And so we're looking at the use of medicine as a behavior, and we want to find out if animals actually do a different behavior because they're sick and it helps them, or because they get manipulated by their infectious diseases. So I love this picture. These are two flies. You can guess what they're doing. The one at the top is a male, the one at the bottom is a female, but here's the catch. That female is dead. And she is dead because she is infected with a fungal parasite. And you look at all that white fluffy material, that's basically the mold, the fungus growing on that female. And what it does, it manipulates the muscle so that she spreads out her wings in an inviting position. And it also produces pheromones that attract the male. So this male is super excited, think he's going to get offspring, but instead he gets sick. Right? So this is a change in behavior driven by the parasite. Sometimes we see behaviors that we're not quite sure yet if they're really use of medicine. And when we look at lemurs and we look at capuchins, they love harassing millipedes. Now millipedes, a lot of them produce very toxic substances that they release when they get harassed by predators, and it's a defense for them. And what these primates like to do, they like squeezing them and pulling them apart and biting them and ripping the heads off. And what that does is it releases all these liquids, and they put it in their own fur, and then they put it in each other's fur. And researchers have shown is that this reduces mosquito bites and it keeps botflies away, but it's also a social function. Right, so it could be it's like us going to the pub, maybe tonight after this, you know, not rubbing beer on each other, but having a beer with each other. You know, it could be a social function. So maybe this, you know, this effect against parasites, mosquitoes and such, is a byproduct. So we don't know that yet. So for the first real well-described example of animals using medicine, we have to go to chimpanzees, and we have to go to the 1980s. And so the story I'm going to tell is one that was done by two researchers. One of them was called Michael Huffman, and he is a primatologist who grew up in the US but always training in Japan. And that's important. So here the deer on the left is actually a messenger of the Shinto gods. So in Japan, the major religions were not Christianity, but Shintoism and Buddhism. And that's very important because they didn't have this urge to make humans unique and different from the rest of the animals. So they saw humans as being part of the animal kingdom. So that was important. And he worked with a ranger at Tanzania National Parks who was a traditional healer. And so Mohammadi was his name, and he came from this long line of traditional healers. And basically what he knew already is that animals can use medicine. So that team was really instrumental in discovering that chimpanzees can use medicine. And the way it happened is that they were following a chimpanzee called Chausiku. She had a name, right, different from primatologists in Europe and North America at the time who gave their animals numbers with the idea, you know, they're reflecting the species. We cannot ascribe personalities to them, so we don't give them names. Different from Jane Goodall, who used names as well in the 1960s already. And so they were following Chausiku, and not at all interested in medicine. They were looking at chimpanzees to find out what is the role of older chimpanzees in maintaining chimpanzee societies. And they were following her, and they noticed that she was off. She was lethargic. She built a nest in the middle of the day, which they normally don't do. She lay on her side to defecate, which they normally don't do. She had dark urine. And then what they see her do is go to the shrub, and she takes off the branches and starts ripping off the bark. And she takes the inner pith and starts sucking it. And at this point, Mohammed tells Michael Huffman, we call this plant majonso, which translates to bitter leaf, and we use it as a medicine in our tradition for all sorts of things. And that was the first time that Huffman thought, maybe she's using this as medicine too. And so the next day they found her again. She recovered after 24 hours, which is the same amount of time that they know in traditional medicine. And then what they found with a whole lot of different studies is that the plant has chemicals that kill parasitic worms, that when the chimpanzees use it and they have the worms, it clears the worms, that the chimpanzees use this plant a lot during the wet season when there are a lot of worms, and also that what these chimpanzees, when they eat it, the dose they take in is the same dose that traditional healers prescribe to their patients, right? So it's like a forensic puzzle putting this all together. What you cannot do with chimpanzees is, have 10 that you make sick and 10 not, doing these experiments, but we can do that with other species, as I will show. But that was really the start. Now in the 1980s, there were other animals. Birds were very well known, a lot of different birds. people knew that they put all sorts of plants in their nests. And what these plants had in common is they're very aromatic, very strong smelling. And so the hypothesis then was, why are they doing it? One of the hypotheses was that these birds do it to basically fumigate their nests. So by putting in the plants in the nest, it keeps all sorts of parasites, bloodsuckers, such as ticks and lice and other things, away from their chicks. Now, the other picture, you may be wondering why there's such an ugly picture there. But this is a sidewalk in the university campus in Mexico City. And if you look carefully, there's a few cigarette butts scattered there. And the reason for that is that this idea that birds use things to fumigate their nests was really demonstrated in the last 10 years by a group of scientists in Mexico City. So Monse Suarez Rodriguez was an undergraduate student, and she joined a lab at the university there to figure out what is the effect of pollution and all the trash that we leave in our cities to the nest and the survival of chicks in those nests. As she was looking at her nest, she was looking at finches and sparrows. She found a lot of nests had a white, fluffy material on them, and she couldn't figure out what it was. Until one day it rained, and she smelled smoke. And that's when she realized what these birds have been doing is collect the filters of the cigarette butts, and people smoke, and they throw it on the floor. And they said it was mostly humanities people doing that, not natural science. Their words, not mine. But these birds would collect them, then go to their nest and pulling out all these feathers, fibers and putting it around their nest. And for those professors in the room, she then went to her advisor, and of course he wouldn't believe her, so she had to make the nest wet. And then he said, oh, it's cigarette butts. It's like, yeah, because advisors are stubborn. They always have to learn for themselves. But what she also found is that when there's more cigarette butts in a nest, there were fewer parasites, right? But that still doesn't mean that the birds are collecting these cigarettes for that particular reason. And then she did this really cool experiments. It did take her 2 years to figure out how I can manipulate a nest without the birds rejecting that nest. But she figured it out. And then what she could do, she could put this artificial lining in the nest, and then she would add live ticks, so the bloodsuckers, or dead ticks that can no longer suck the blood of the chicks. And then she monitored how many cigarette butts the birds would collect, and she found that when there were live ticks, the birds collected more cigarettes, and the chicks had a higher survival rate. So, very nice experiment. Now, that doesn't mean that we should all start smoking and throwing our cigarette butts on the ground. It's actually really bad. And I actually asked the researchers, are you worried about public health campaigns being successful? Because what the birds are going to do? They said, well, they're just going to go back to collecting the plants that they would have. But this is such an easy find for them because it's right there. But also, what they found is that some of their red blood cells had malformations for these chicks. So what that means is that it works against parasites, but there are side effects. And this is true for the chimpanzees that use the bitter leaf. Too high doses can kill the chimpanzees. It's the same for monarchs. Too toxic, too medicinal, it will kill the caterpillars. And so this is something that animals and humans have in common when we think about what is a medicine. It's actually pretty hard to define. But side effects is one of the commonalities between humans and other animals. Here's another one of my favorite animals, David Attenborough. So, you know, he, like Jane Goodall, has done so much for understanding and respect for nature. And here he's in a documentary, and this is really to show you that we went from these large-brained animals that was already controversial in the 1980s to persuade people animals can use medicine to now looking at insects. Because he is here at a nest of ants in the Jura mountains, and what these ants do is they collect these pieces of resin. Resin is the sticky stuff that trees produce. So if you've ever, decorated a Christmas tree, you get sticky hands, that's the resin. The trees use it to heal wounds and protect themselves against viruses and bacteria and stuff. And these ants collect this, put it in their nest, and it keeps all sorts of things away. Fungal infections, viruses, bacteria, and it keeps their babies healthy. So ants do this, and there's been beautiful research showing that. And honeybees do it too. Here we have a honeybee worker, and some of you may know that honeybees have specialized pollen baskets on their hind legs that they use to collect pollen. Now some workers use those to collect this sticky stuff from plants. And this stuff is so sticky when they get back to the nest, they need other workers to help them remove it from their legs. And then they mix it with the wax that they produce, make it into a substance called propolis. And this is what they then smear around the colonies. When you look at wild bees that live in hollow trees, very rough surfaces. They fill this up with this propolis to make this beautiful, shiny envelope. Now, people have used this for thousands of years. You can go to some places around the world, go to the corner of the street and buy some propolis. And I would help for itchy throat, by the way. So I was looking for it today and I couldn't find it. This is not one of those places. But people always said, well, honeybees, they don't use it for medicine. They just use it for cement. And it's one of those things like we're smarter. We know that they make medicine that they don't know they're making, but we know somehow. But now we know they do. This is the importance of honeybees. And of course, I know there is, of course, discussion whether we should really care about honeybees versus wild bees. But given our current agricultural system, if you look at the importance of honeybees for the pollination of our crops, we would lose a lot if we lose our bees. And the honeybees are not doing well, and we see that in the UK, we see that in the US. We had the biggest mortality this last winter in the US, even over the last 30 years, and it has been pretty bad already. And one of the reasons it's bad is that these bees have a lot of challenges, that's pesticides and other things, but also parasites, lots of parasites. If you look carefully up there, there is a mite called Varroa destructor. Well, that is a very apt name. This is a very destructive mite. Think of it as a mite as big as a big donut that sits on your tummy sucking out your liver, because that's what they're doing. And in the process, they're also spreading all sorts of viruses. So these mites are very bad, and they have gotten worse over time. And so the problem that we're facing is that honeybees are actually pretty good at preventing these mites and the viruses and the bacteria with that propolis they make. But we don't let them. So when you go to a beekeeping 101 class in the US, and I don't know how it's here, but the first thing they tell you is how to remove the propolis, because beekeepers don't like it. It's sticky, it seals the lid shut to the box, so you want to get rid of it. But by doing that, we get rid of that medicine. Now, the really good thing is you can very easily bring it back. And researchers have shown this. If you make the boxes of rough planks with grooves, the bees will start filling it up with the propolis, and they will be healthier and still make the same amount of honey, which is what beekeepers care about. Similar story for livestock. So as humans in the West, we have this tendency to think that we know everything better. And I've said it a few times already, but it is also true for livestock. Right? So when we raise our livestock, we give them this mixed ration food that has all the nutrients that we think they need, but what it doesn't include is any of the natural medicines that these animals would collect in nature. And there has been decades of research now from Utah State University where researchers have shown that sheep and goats and cattle are really good at learning how to medicate themselves. So when they're sick, say with worms, you give them a particular plant, they recover. Now you make an association, and so the next time they're sick, they're going to go for that plant and they medicate themselves. And so one way to bring that back is to have paddocks, bring the animals back outside, not just in a paddock with one species of grass, but really make it a diverse ecosystem where they can find not just the food, but also the medicines that they need. And the researchers have told me that even in the more industrialized livestock industry, there is already some technology that tells how much each animal gets to eat. So you could adapt that to then also be able to provide them different choices so that they can medicate if they need to. So how do animals know, right? So this is always a big question. And so in some ways the answer, because we have seen this, right? Because we see a lot of the controversy that was there, even with the chimpanzees, is that they're not smart enough, they don't know what they're doing, and let alone, when we talk about insects. And the answer really is that oftentimes they don't need to know. And so this is a great example, the woolly bear caterpillar, also known as a fuzzy wuzzy by some people. These caterpillars are different from the ones that turn into monarch butterflies because they can eat a lot of different plants. And some of those plants contain alkaloids, which act as medicine against parasitoid flies. So I love parasites, so bear with me. Parasitoid flies are amazing creatures. So these are flies that lay their eggs on caterpillars. The maggots come out, eat their way into the inside of the caterpillar, eat it up from the inside out, and then burst out of the body, killing the caterpillar in its wake. Some of you may have seen I think in 1977, right? Alien movie, the first one. There have been like 2,600 remakes since, but the concept's always the same. There's something, jumping out of that, bursting out of the body. And so this is really like that alien parasite. Now, But what is amazing about these caterpillars is that when they eat alkaloids, they can kill these flies. And researchers have shown that these caterpillars have 4 different taste receptors, one of which tastes these alkaloids specifically. And they manage to put electrodes in a single taste receptor in sick and healthy caterpillars, feed them alkaloids, and then they find that the neurons that connect the taste receptors to the brain start firing really, really rapidly when they're sick. And so what that means from the caterpillar's point of view is that when they're sick, these alkaloids just taste amazing. And because they taste amazing, they eat more of it, and therefore they kill the parasite. Right? So what that means is the caterpillar doesn't need to know what an alkaloid is. It doesn't need to know it's infected. It doesn't need to know that it's going to get better. All it knows is that these alkaloids just taste amazing, and it keeps eating them. So I think, with that kind of mechanism, which I think is true for a lot of animals, it's not hard to see that animals can use medicine that's going to help them. But of course, that's not the only mechanism. We also have the individual learning that I already mentioned for the goats and the sheep, and then there is social learning as well. And so the social learning is actually interesting. So we go back to Jane Goodall, who noticed very early on that sometimes when you look at the feces of a chimpanzee, it has whole leaves in them that are not digested, they have not been chewed, they're just there, completely intact. And so the 1980s, Huffman and a lot of other colleagues really readdressed that. And what they found is that oftentimes chimpanzees swallow these leaves whole. And what all these leaves have in common is that they're very, very hairy. They're very rough leaves, and they kind of work like Velcro. So when they go through the gut, they scrape out the parasites. They also irritate the gut, so the chimpanzees have diarrhea and basically purge these parasites. But some of these leaves are like this size, and you can imagine that's not very fun to swallow, and the chimpanzees agree. So what they do is they fold it up before they swallow. And as you can imagine, there's different ways to fold up a leaf, and different groups of chimpanzees use different ways to do that. And you can even see that in different groups in zoos where you give them different leaves. It means one chimpanzee comes up with a method, the rest copies it. So now we have medicine and we have culture, 2 things we used to think were uniquely human, right? Right there on display in chimpanzees. All right. Any dog lovers in the room? Yeah? Yeah? Have you ever seen your dogs eat grass? So this is one of those things. It's actually very similar. When our dogs eat grass, it's very similar to these chimpanzees eating these very hairy leaves. This is my dog. And actually, I have 2, but this is the one we had while I wrote the book. The other one came after the book was done, so he's not in the book. And I'm not telling him because I don't want him to feel left out. But so this is my dog eating grass. And so eating grass is a very, very common thing for these dogs to do. Cats do it too. And one of the surprising things for me was that there's very little research. When you look at the veterinary literature, there's maybe 5 papers of veterinary scientists that have looked at this in our cats and our dogs. But the nice thing is people have looked at wild carnivores, and of course carnivores are generally animals that are supposed to eat meat, but you find that whether it's lions or it is wolves or it's mountain lions, they all eat grass every now and then. And over many decades, people have found is when they do that, they find worms when the animals throw it up. And this is a recent paper from earlier this year, a jaguar in South America, and the researchers saw that it was eating this grass, really, really rough grass that even goats wouldn't like, and it was eating it, it threw up, and then out came the parasites. And so when we look at our animals, that's probably when they're eating grass, they're doing it for a similar reason. I'm not saying your dogs have worms, but they probably feel discomfort because, again, they don't need to know what makes them feel bad, right? But they know it does. And actually, my son actually took that picture on the left here. And more recently, and this was the story of my new dog, it was actually, I remember the day, it was the day after, it was the 15th of March, the day after Pi Day. Pi Day a thing here? So in the US, Pi Day is a big thing. The 14th of March, right? The number pi, 3.14, and then a lot of decimals. And so my other dog comes into my room and he's got like this rubber band in his mouth. It's like, what is that? So I pull it out and it seems like it's only half. So then I have to do my forensics, figure out where this came from. And my go-to is, of course, my son, because I don't know if you have a 17-year-old, but if you look at their room, there's stuff everywhere. So he's always my first suspect. And say, yeah, I got that yesterday. And it's like, well, I said, but Jacob, where's the rest of the bandits? He didn't know. And then I took my dog for a walk and he ate grass. 6 hours later, out came the other decimal places of the pi number, right? So that's to say that my dog felt discomfort, obviously, from having these decimals sitting in its stomach, and then ate grass, not because he had worms, but he still has that ability to do that. All right, cat lovers in the room? So my experience is cat lovers usually make a bit more noise than the dog lovers. Can we do that? So let's hear it for the dogs. Yay. And the cats? Yay. See? The cat people always win. It's very funny. But so cats, catnip. You know, so you may know your cat likes catnip. Maybe you have toys that contain catnip. And so people have known about catnip for a long time. There is actually evidence from thousands of years ago that people grew catnip, and we don't use it for anything. So the idea is they use it for their cats. When you look at Japanese literature and stories, folklore, so in Japan there's another species called silver vine, which is even more potent than the catnip that sets our cats off here. And so they have stories there where the mice, they actually know that you can intoxicate cats with silver vine and thereby win battles. So people have known this for a long time. But it's only the last 10 years that Japanese researchers have really figured out why cats actually like these plants so much. So I'm going to show a few videos. And so the first thing that the researchers did was go to the silver vine plants, extract the chemicals, figure out what are the chemicals that actually set off these cats, what makes them so excited. And so they have different fractions, put those in little petri dishes in a cage, and then they add a cat and see what is the chemical that's going to make this cat excited. Right, and so here you see this cat is sampling, it's sniffing, it's tasting, and then it's going to tell us what is the actual important chemical in that plant. There it goes. All right, so you know, whereas we would smell that and detect no difference, right? So these cats are really good. Okay, so why do they like it so much? So I have been told that when people do long distance running, they make endorphins. I have never experienced this, so I really don't like running, okay? But I've been told that some of you do this, and so cats do the same. They make their own opioids. And so these are really like the pleasure hormones that they make them feel better. And so in this case, you know, when they looked at these cats, they said, well, they really have this pleasure response, so let's knock out the pleasure response. So this is the same cat on day 1, where they didn't do anything, they just gave it some salt solution. So that cat can still feel pleasure, and so there's the chemical, and it's licking it, and it's getting excited. On day 2, this is the same cat, and they gave it a blocker, so it can no longer feel the effects of this opioid that it makes. So that cat is no longer a happy cat, okay? And so you can give it those chemicals, and the cat is just sitting there like, just let me get out of here, right? So it's temporary, so on day 3, this is a happy cat again, okay? Just want to make sure they didn't make the cat depressed for the entire life. So then the researchers went to a conference, actually, I think it was in London, and there was a mosquito researcher there, and she said, you know what I find really intriguing? When I look at your videos, I see these cats are not just rolling around. It seems like they're really coating themselves in this chemical. It's not just like they're rolling around anywhere. They go for it. They roll around. They want to get it in their fur, right? And so what the researchers then did is like, well, if that's the case, let's put the chemicals at the top of the cage where the cats can no longer roll around with the gravity, they would fall down. So if it's just rolling around for fun, these cats should go to the bottom and still roll around. But what you'll see is the cat is actually trying to roll around at the top of the cage. It's really trying to make contact with this chemical. See? Defying gravity is not for cats. That's for a different musical. So then you have, so why is this? So the researchers actually found that by doing this, they coat themselves in this mosquito repellent. And so they did other experiments where they had the cats and they gave them the chemicals on one cat, not the other, put the cats in a cage, release mosquitoes. For obvious reasons, there are no videos of that. But they didn't because they felt sorry. Actually, the researchers repeated the experiment with themselves. But what they found is that the cats with the chemical didn't get as many mosquito bites. So these chemicals really work like a repellent. And then the researchers put it on their own arms, put their arms in a cage, and found it works for humans too. So they have now patented this chemical to see if we can develop it into a chemical for human use. So I think it's really fascinating because it tells us that even today we can look at our animals and learn things from them that can actually help us against our own parasites as well. Now the biggest surprise for me in writing the book was that that wasn't a novel thing. It was a novel thing for me. It was a novel thing for Western science. But traditional healers and shamans have looked at animals for a very long time. So for thousands, maybe millions of years. So when you look, for example, at Native Americans, they often become bears, and they learn from bears, because they view bears as the master of medicine. And what is really intriguing, they really become bears during these rituals, and a lot of their medicines are named after bears. And this may seem remote, but one of the medicines that was discovered this way is aspirin. Because when bears come out of hibernation, they're all stiff. You know, they've been lying still for months on end. They're stiff, they're sore, they're inflamed. The first thing they do is they go and eat the bark of willow trees, which is very high levels of salicylic acid, which the company Bayer, funny word joke there, but it's not, if you're German you would say Bayer, but in English it works. Anyway, but they made it into this chemical. We call it aspirin now. So most of us have probably used this at some point in our life, but it was originally discovered by bears for us. And they're not the only ones. You look at communities in Asia, Africa, they look at elephants. And so in Tanzania there is a treatment even today where people, when they have stomach upset, they use a treatment, a tea, essentially, that was invented by an elephant. It was discovered by the grandfather of Mohammadi, who I mentioned earlier, who worked with Mike Hoffman on the chimpanzees. Goats are another animal that have told us a lot. So you may be aware of the story of coffee. So coffee was discovered by goats. There was this herder in what is now Ethiopia, a goat herder, and he noticed when his goats were eating the berries of coffee bush, they became alert and jumping and dancing around. So a lot of cafes or coffee shops in the US are named after this. I think there is a company in the UK too that's called Dancing Goats, and this is based on that idea. So goats discovered coffee for us. They discovered other things too. I know there's children in the room. I'm going to skip over this. You can guess what I was going to say here, but goats have discovered other things too. So that's all to say that animals are really good at teaching us things about discovering new treatments and new medicines, even today, because the cats showed us even recently that there's chemicals that we hadn't discovered yet, but they had. But at the same time, we're facing this real big problem right now, with a lot of species going extinct, right? So scientists estimate that the extinction rate right now is actually exceeding what killed the dinosaurs. Most of them, birds are still here, most of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. Right? And I think that's a very sobering thing, a very sobering thought, because what that means is, of course, you know, we should preserve nature anyway. But what we're doing is we're losing a lot of the medicines, but we're also losing a lot of the pharmacists and the doctors that have known about these medicines, even when we haven't. Right? So I think it's just yet another reason that we should really try to preserve nature. And so that's one of the reasons that I am part of this nature conservation organization that was actually set up by former First Lady Rosalind Carter, and she was very interested in saving pollinators. And so what we're doing is really recreating native habitats across the United States, but also in different places. And so we go to places, plant a lot of natives that really help a lot of different species, not just for food, but shelter, but medicine as well. And one of the things that I find really intriguing, another big surprise for me, is that when you think about what is the biggest crop in the United States, I don't know if that's the same here, but in the United States, the biggest crop is not corn or soy, which I thought it would be. It's actually just lawn grass. The grass we put in our front yards or on golf courses, and it's terrible. It doesn't do anything, takes water, pesticides, fertilizer, doesn't produce anything for anything that lives there, right? And so we estimate that if you just replace about 10% of that, you can go a really, really long way, recreating native nature that helps our pollinators, our pets, food, medicine, all sorts of different things. And I want to end with this video. So here you get to see my other dog, the white, black one there. And so this was actually during a photo shoot because the university newspaper wanted to write a story when my book came out in March. And they said, bring your dogs. We said, it will be fun. And so while we were setting up the lights, my dogs decided to start eating grass. And I thought it was so funny because it was almost like they were saying, you know, guys, I don't really know why you make such a fuss about all of this stuff. None of this is new, right? We have known about this for millions of years. Thank you so much.